In the autumn of 1968, the entire population of the Blackwood Academy for Gifted Youth vanished from the face of the earth. The official story claimed financial ruin and a swift, chaotic evacuation. 40 years later, a buried building would reveal a far more sinister truth. They hadn't gone anywhere at all, and their final moments had been meticulously orchestrated by the very man they trusted with their lives. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. Blackwood Academy was an isolated utopia, a beacon of progressive education, nestled deep within a remote Oregon mountain valley. It was a place built on the promise of nurturing genius, far from the distractions of the mundane world. Its campus was a stunning blend of modern architecture and untamed wilderness, a sanctuary where the nation's brightest young minds were sent to realize their boundless potential under the guidance of a visionary. That visionary was Dr. Julian Croft. To the parents and the academic world, he was a charismatic revolutionary, a pioneer of educational theory. He spoke of unlocking human potential with a fervor that was both inspiring and utterly convincing. He wasn't merely a headmaster. He was the architect of a new future, and the students of Blackwood were his cherished prototypes, the foundation upon which this future would be built. The first official word of the end came via cold, impersonal telegrams. They arrived at homes across the country, each one a harbinger of a quiet, devastating loss. The messages spoke of a sudden, catastrophic financial collapse. The school, the parents were informed, was being shuttered immediately due to insurmountable debt. The language was legalistic and final, offering no room for negotiation or appeal, just the stark reality of a dream dissolved into bankruptcy. Each telegram carried a single, crucial promise, meant to quell the rising tide of parental panic. It assured them that their children were safe, already en route home on specially chartered buses. This was presented as a necessary logistical measure, a consequence of the Academy's extreme isolation. The buses, they were told, would arrive at designated regional drop-off points over the next 48 hours. It was a promise that offered a sliver of comfort in the midst of chaos. Across the nation, parents gathered at those designated meeting points, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and growing anxiety. They waited for hours that stretched into a full day, then two. They scanned the empty highways for the sight of a charter bus that would never appear. The silence from the school was absolute, and the initial anxiety slowly began to curdle into a permanent, gnawing dread that would define the rest of their lives. The initial investigation was brief, frustrating, and ultimately fruitless. When authorities finally reached the remote campus, they found the main gates locked and chained. A paper trail meticulously confirmed the bankruptcy story, providing a neat, if heartless, explanation. The legal documents were all in order. Dr. Croft had vanished. As far as the law was concerned, it was a tragic but straightforward case of institutional failure, not a mass disappearance. The local community, separated from the Academy by miles of dense forest, saw the locked gates and accepted the official narrative. In the tumultuous social landscape of the late 1960s, the sudden collapse of a radical experimental school was hardly unbelievable. The mountain had a way of swallowing endeavors that didn't belong. The story of Blackwood's failure became a simple fact, and the world outside quickly moved on, leaving the mystery to fester in silence. Over the decades, the story morphed into the legend of the lost school. It became a piece of chilling local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the academy in the woods that simply ceased to exist one day. The specific details of the students and their names blurred and faded with time. until only the hollow ache of the unresolved mystery remained, a permanent scar on the valley's history. But on its final day, October 12th, 1968, Blackwood was anything but a ghost story. The crisp autumn air was alive with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside the Academy's sun-drenched halls, the day began with the familiar, comforting rhythm of intense intellectual pursuit. It was a day like any other, humming with the quiet energy of minds at work, completely unaware of the approaching terminus. In the grand, wood-paneled library, a brilliant student named Eleanor Finch was lost in the pages of a novel, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was the embodiment of the Academy's promise, sharp, inquisitive, and driven by a profound love of knowledge. Like her peers, she saw Blackwood not just as a school, but as the only place in the world where she truly belonged, a sanctuary for minds like hers. The routine of the day was a portrait of academic harmony. In the chemistry labs, beakers bubbled over Bunsen burners as students conducted complex experiments. In ethics class, a lively debate unfolded about the nature of free will. In the sunlit art studio, canvases were being prepped for new creations. Every corner of the campus was filled with the quiet, focused hum of extraordinary potential, being carefully cultivated and nurtured. Yet beneath this idyllic surface, a subtle undercurrent of tension had been growing for weeks. Students whispered about Dr. Croft's mandatory sessions in the sealed West Wing. They called them cognitive accelerations. Those who attended emerged pale and disoriented, complaining of blinding headaches and fragmented memories. They were told it was the price of progress, a necessary strain on the path to unlocking their true intellectual power. The West Wing itself was an anomaly in the otherwise open and transparent campus. It was a windowless, soundproofed annex that was strictly off-limits to all but a select few. Its purpose was a subject of intense speculation and rumor among the students, a place of both fear and a certain morbid fascination. It was Dr. Croft's private laboratory, and the nature of his work there remained a closely guarded, unsettling secret. The parents, of course, were kept entirely unaware of these experiments. Dr. Croft's glowing correspondence with them painted a picture of unmitigated success, of pedagogical breakthroughs that would soon change the world of education forever. They had entrusted him with their gifted children, and their faith in his vision was absolute. The idea that he would ever endanger them was simply unthinkable, a violation of the sacred trust he had so carefully built. At precisely 2:15 p.m., the routine of the day did not just end. It shattered. A high-pitched, piercing alarm, a sound no one on campus had ever heard before, sliced through the academic calm. It echoed unnaturally through the valley, a shrill electronic scream that signaled an abrupt and total break from the established order. All activity across the Academy ceased in an instant, replaced by a stunned, questioning silence. Then, Dr. Croft's voice filled the void, broadcast over the intercom system into every room. It was remarkably steady, authoritative, and possessed a strange, almost hypnotic calmness. He announced an emergency evacuation drill, his tone leaving no room for questions or debate. He assured everyone that there was no immediate danger, but that their compliance was paramount for their own safety. His voice was the sound of absolute control. The instruction that followed was the first clear sign that this was no ordinary drill. Students and staff were ordered to leave everything exactly as it was. Books left open on desks, equations half-finished on chalkboards, personal belongings abandoned. They were directed to proceed in an orderly fashion, not to the designated open-air fire assembly point, but towards the heavily fortified storm shelter built into the mountainside. The storm shelter was a monolithic concrete structure, a grim relic of Cold War paranoia, whose true purpose on the campus of a progressive school was a complete mystery. Its massive steel door was rumored to be strong enough to withstand a direct nuclear blast. It was a place designed for survival against an unimaginable threat. And now, for reasons no one understood, the entire school was being directed into its depths. There was no panic. There was no chaos. These were disciplined, gifted minds, conditioned to follow the logic and direction of their brilliant headmaster without question. Their trust in Dr. Croft was the foundational principle of their existence at Blackwood. They formed silent, orderly lines, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and quiet obedience as they moved across the manicured grounds toward the grim concrete bunker. The final image of them, captured by no camera and witnessed by no outsider, was of a silent procession. 32 of the nation's brightest students and 5 dedicated staff members walked calmly toward the yawning entrance of the storm shelter. They filed inside, disappearing one by one from the afternoon sun into the cold, artificial light of the subterranean structure, placing their fate entirely in Croft's hands. The closing of the massive steel door was a sound that no one outside the Academy's grounds heard. It was a deep, resonant boom of locking mechanisms engaging, a sound of finality that sealed the fate of every person within. The world outside continued on its axis, completely oblivious to the profound and permanent silence that had just fallen over the Blackwood Academy for gifted youth. For the next 40 years, that silence would be officially interpreted as absence. The carefully constructed narrative of bankruptcy and a hasty evacuation became the accepted truth, a bureaucratic tragedy that left dozens of families with no closure, only a universe of unanswered questions. The story provided a logical, if unsatisfying, end to the ambitious project that was Blackwood. The disappearance of the Academy's population was not treated as a lingering mystery of where they had gone, but rather as a statement of established fact. They were gone, scattered. The legal documents, the abandoned campus, and the locked gates all served as the tombstone for a dream that had, by all official accounts, simply died of financial neglect, its students and faculty lost to the winds of misfortune. The world was convinced that the people of Blackwood had been dispersed by institutional failure, their bright futures extinguished by simple mismanagement. But the truth was far more contained and infinitely more terrifying. It was not a story of absence, but of presence, a horrifying secret waiting patiently under tons of earth for a single, accidental discovery to finally break the silence. 40 years after the last telegram was sent in the late summer of 2008, the Oregon wilderness was disturbed not by memory, but by science. A state-mandated forestry survey crew was methodically working its way across the valley, their task a mundane but necessary assessment of soil stability. They employed ground-penetrating radar, a technology that would have seemed like science fiction in 1968. The device hummed with a quiet indifference, painting a picture of the Earth's unseen layers, its primary purpose to identify potential geological hazards before logging operations could begin in the surrounding state forest. The operators were accustomed to the familiar patterns of bedrock, root systems, and subterranean water tables. But on August 4th, the radar screen began to display an anomaly so profound it brought the entire operation to a halt. Deep beneath a ridge that local maps marked as the site of a minor, unrecorded landslide, the readings showed a massive, unnaturally geometric structure. It was rectangular, rigid, and far too large to be a forgotten septic tank or a homesteader's buried cellar. The clean, sharp lines were undeniably man-made, a silent architectural ghost sleeping under tons of earth and stone. Initial theories were floated with a mix of professional curiosity and speculative excitement. It could be a forgotten Cold War-era government bunker or a hidden mining operation from a bygone century. But as they cross-referenced the coordinates with old county survey maps, a far more chilling possibility emerged. The buried structure was located on the exact parcel of land that once belonged to the Blackwood Academy for Gifted Youth. The landslide wasn't a minor, natural event. It was a tomb, and it had been concealing the school's main academic hall for 4 decades. The news traveled through official channels with the slow, deliberate gravity of a major discovery. It eventually reached the desk of Dr. Alistair Finch, a 54-year-old architectural historian at the University of Chicago. Alistair had built his life on the solid, dependable foundations of fact and historical record, a career that was a subconscious defense against the formless, unanswered question that had hollowed out his childhood. The call came from an Oregon state official, the voice on the other end clinical and precise, speaking of radar anomalies and excavation permits, words that felt alien and disconnected from the raw 40-year-old wound of his sister's disappearance. Alistair Finch had not been to Oregon in over 30 years. The state existed in his mind as a landscape of grief, a place he had fled as soon as he was able. Now he found himself on a plain, the dense green canopy of the Pacific Northwest spreading out below him like a dark, wrinkled shroud. He was a man who traded in the tangible evidence of the past, blueprints, foundations, structural designs. He was returning not as a grieving younger brother, but as an expert, a historian summoned to help interpret a ruin. He told himself this repeatedly, a mantra to keep the encroaching tide of personal history at bay. When he arrived, the site was no longer a quiet patch of wilderness. It had been transformed into a sprawling, high-security federal crime scene. The air buzzed with the low hum of generators and the clipped, professional chatter of FBI agents. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire area, and a massive excavated pit revealed the upper corner of a concrete building, its modern lines stark and incongruous against the ancient forest. The landslide had not been a chaotic tumble of rock. It had been a neat, almost surgical burial, preserving what lay beneath with an eerie perfection that spoke of intention. An agent from the Bureau's cold case unit, a grim-faced man named Miles Corbin, met him at the perimeter. Corbin recognized that Alistair was more than just a consultant. He was a living link to the silent building before them. He escorted Alistair past the security line and towards the excavated entrance, a dark maw leading into the earth. The air that drifted out was stale and cold, carrying the scent of dust, chalk, and time itself. It was the smell of a vacuum, of a moment that had been hermetically sealed away from the world for 40 years. Stepping inside was like crossing a threshold into a ghost story made real. The emergency lights of the forensic team cast long, dancing shadows down a hallway that was perfectly preserved. Lockers lined the walls, some of them slightly ajar. A bulletin board still displayed announcements for a chess tournament and a poetry reading that never happened. It was a scene of profound and unsettling stillness, a place where life had not been packed up or moved on. It had simply ceased, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging an entire world into a permanent, silent stasis. They entered a classroom, and the illusion of an evacuation was immediately and violently shattered. Textbooks lay open on desks, their pages covered in a fine layer of gray dust. On the large blackboard at the front of the room, A complex physics equation was left half-finished, the chalk still resting in the tray below it. On one desk sat a metal lunchbox, and next to it, an apple with a single bite taken out of it, now a shrunken, petrified husk. This was not the scene of a planned departure. It was the scene of an interruption, sudden and absolute. Every room they entered told the same impossible story. In the chemistry lab, glass beakers and Bunsen burners were arranged for an experiment that was never completed. In the art studio, a canvas on an easel held the faint charcoal outline of a portrait, its subject destined to remain forever undefined. The sheer ordinariness of the scene was what made it so horrific. It was a portrait of dozens of lives, each one humming with purpose and potential, brought to a simultaneous, inexplicable halt in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. For Alistair, the experience was a disorienting blend of academic analysis and overwhelming personal grief. He forced himself to observe, to document the architectural details and the state of preservation, but with every step, he was walking in his sister's final footsteps. He could almost feel her presence in the profound quiet, the ghost of her intellectual curiosity alive in the very air of the place she had loved so much. He was searching for an answer, but he was also, desperately, searching for her, for some final trace of the brilliant, vibrant girl he had lost. Finally, Detective Corbin led him to the library. It was a grand, two-story room, its large windows now blocked by a wall of compacted earth. Books were scattered on the heavy oak tables, left open as if their readers had only stepped away for a moment. The silence in this room was different, heavier, weighted by the unread words and unfinished thoughts of 32 of the nation's brightest young minds. It was a cathedral of abandoned knowledge, and it was here that the first real clue in 40 years was about to break the silence. An investigator, working under a portable floodlight, pointed toward a small study carrel in the corner. A simple, brass nameplate was affixed to the desk, tarnished but still legible, Eleanor Finch. Alistair felt his breath catch in his throat. He approached the desk slowly, the 40 years separating him from his sister collapsing into a single, painful step. It was her space, a place where she had spent countless hours, and it had been waiting for him, untouched, for his entire adult life. On the desk lay a thick copy of Moby Dick, a novel he knew she had been rereading with an almost academic fervor. Its cover was coated in the same fine dust as everything else in the room. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, his fingers leaving clean streaks on the dusty cover. He opened the book, its spine cracking in the silence. Tucked between the pages, marking a passage in the chapter on the whiteness of the whale, was a small, neatly folded piece of notebook paper. With painstaking care, Alistair unfolded the note. It was written in Eleanor's distinctive, elegant cursive, the ink slightly faded but perfectly clear. The words were not a diary entry or a stray thought about literature. They were a message of fear, a crack in the idyllic facade of Blackwood that had been hidden for 4 decades. They were a voice from beyond the silence, a testament to the fact that the students of Blackwood were not willing participants in their own disappearance. They were prisoners of a terrible secret. The note read, "He says the headaches are the price of progress. But I saw the sick room. It's not progress. It's a cage." Alistair read the words once, then twice, the meaning settling into his soul with the cold, heavy weight of absolute certainty. The he was undoubtedly Dr. Croft. The progress was his so-called cognitive acceleration experiments. This small piece of paper was irrefutable proof. It was the first solid evidence that the official narrative of a simple bankruptcy was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate, meticulously crafted lie. This was the turning point. Eleanor's note transformed the site from a tragic archaeological curiosity into an active and urgent crime scene. The discovery of the buried school had been shocking, but this note was the key. It provided motive and context, suggesting that the students were aware that something was deeply wrong within the academy's walls. The long-held fantasy that they had been safely evacuated and had simply started new lives elsewhere evaporated in the cold, dusty air of the library. Detective Corbin immediately had the note photographed and sealed in an evidence bag. The atmosphere among the investigative team shifted palpably. They were no longer just recovering a piece of history. They were unearthing a mass grave, even without the presence of bodies. The school itself was the evidence of a crime, a perfectly preserved snapshot of the moment before a catastrophe that had been intentionally and successfully concealed from the entire world. The news of the note and the state of the classrooms was deliberately withheld from the press. The investigation was now a tightly controlled operation, focused on a single, burning question. If the bankruptcy was a lie, what was it designed to hide? The logical, orderly state of the classrooms ruled out a panic or a chaotic event. Whatever happened on October 12, 1968, was orchestrated, controlled, and executed with a terrifying degree of precision. Alistair Finch, standing in the heart of his sister's final moments, was no longer just a historian. He was now the investigation's most valuable asset. The fragmented memories of Eleanor's letters home, once dismissed as the typical anxieties of a boarding school student, were now critical pieces of a puzzle. He remembered her mentioning Dr. Croft's private sessions, the strange fatigue of her classmates, and a growing sense of secrecy that had begun to permeate the campus in its final weeks. The official case of the Blackwood disappearance was formally and publicly reopened, reclassified from a cold missing persons file to a suspected mass homicide. The story exploded into the national consciousness, the legend of the lost school resurrected as a chilling modern mystery. For the handful of surviving family members, elderly and worn down by decades of uncertainty, the news was a brutal mixture of hope for answers and terror at what those answers might be. The focus of the new investigation narrowed with incredible speed to a single person of interest. There was only one man with the authority, the motive, and the absolute control required to orchestrate such a monumental deception. A man who had built a utopia, promised a new future, and then vanished behind a wall of legal documents and a literal wall of earth. The search for the truth about Blackwood had become the hunt for Dr. Julian Croft. Alistair provided the investigators with every letter Eleanor had ever sent, every photograph, every memory. He worked alongside them, his academic rigor now fueled by a cold, burning need for justice. He knew that the answer to what happened to his sister and her classmates was not scattered to the winds, as the world had been led to believe for 40 years. It was contained, concentrated, and locked away in the mind of the school's visionary founder. The discovery of the school refuted the official narrative of where the students went. They had gone nowhere. Eleanor's note began to explain why. It confirmed the existence of a dark secret at the heart of the academy, a secret that someone was willing to bury an entire school to protect. It was the first piece of evidence that proved the students were not victims of a financial collapse, but of a monstrous betrayal at the hands of the one man they were taught to trust implicitly. The search for the truth had a new, terrifying dimension. It was no longer about finding out what happened to the students, but about uncovering the nature of Dr. Croft's experiments. What was the sick room? What was the progress that came at such a terrible price? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last, all leading back to the charismatic educator who had vanished from public life, taking his secrets with him. The forensic teams continued their meticulous work, cataloging every book, every piece of paper, every abandoned possession within the school's buried walls. They were searching for more clues, more notes, anything that could build a case against a man who had successfully hidden his crime for longer than many of the investigators had been alive. The school was a time capsule, and they were now in a race to decipher its message before the man who sealed it was beyond the reach of the law. The discovery of the preserved academy was a seismic shock, a rupture in the accepted history of the valley. It brought the past crashing into the present with an undeniable force, demanding a reckoning that was 40 years overdue. The official story was dead, shattered by the hum of a radar and the words on a single, folded piece of paper. A new, far more sinister narrative was just beginning to take shape. For Alistair, the discovery was both a vindication and a curse. His entire life had been defined by a question mark, a void. Now the void was being filled with something far more horrifying than uncertainty. He had found his sister's last words, but they were not words of hope or farewell. They were an accusation, a warning from the grave that pointed directly at the man who had promised her a brilliant future. The investigators began to trace Dr. Julian Croft's financial trail from 1968, uncovering a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. It became clear that the bankruptcy was a fiction funded by the school's own liquidated assets. The plan had been in motion for months, a meticulously designed exit strategy. The landslide was no accident. It was the final brilliant stroke of a master manipulator, the closing of a tomb. The entire foundation of the 40-year-old mystery had been a lie. The students and staff of Blackwood had not been scattered by misfortune. They had been gathered, contained, and erased from the world with chilling efficiency. The truth was not lost. It had been deliberately and methodically buried. But this discovery was only the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. Eleanor Finch's note was not merely a clue. It was a Rosetta Stone for a 40-year-old crime. In the sterile environment of a mobile command unit, the small piece of paper lay under protective glass, its penciled words radiating a truth that dismantled decades of accepted history. For Detective Miles Corbin, it transformed a perplexing cold case into a hunt for a master manipulator. For Alistair Finch, it was his sister's final, desperate act of witness, a message in a bottle that had finally washed ashore. The investigation was no longer about where the students had gone. It was about what had been done to them by the man they called their protector. The discovery forged an immediate and powerful alliance between the cold case detective and the architectural historian. Corbin possessed the methodical rigor of law enforcement, while Alistair held the institutional memory of Blackwood, filtered through the intimate lens of family correspondence. He spent days with investigators, meticulously cross-referencing every line from Eleanor's letters with the physical evidence unearthed from the school. Vague mentions of classmate illnesses, once dismissed as youthful exaggeration, were now re-examined as potential symptoms. Her complaints about the windowless West Wing were no longer teenage angst, but the observations of a prisoner documenting the architecture of her cage. The first official casualty of the new investigation was the bankruptcy narrative. An elite team of FBI forensic accountants was tasked with a singular mission: reconstruct the financial death of Blackwood Academy. They descended into the dusty archives of Oregon's state records, digitizing ledger books and property deeds that hadn't been seen by human eyes since the Johnson administration. They were searching for the truth in the numbers, a truth they suspected would be far more deliberate and sinister than a simple failure of accounting. The paper trail, which had so effectively ended the initial inquiry in 1968, was now being reread with modern eyes. The story the numbers told was one of meticulous, predatory planning. Far from being insolvent, the Academy's endowment was robust in the months leading up to its closure. The accountants uncovered a complex series of transactions beginning in the spring of 1968. Dr. Julian Croft had systematically liquidated the school's most valuable assets, stocks, bonds, and land holdings, not to pay debts, but to amass a massive, liquid fortune. The money wasn't disappearing into a void of bankruptcy. It was being funneled, with surgical precision, into a labyrinth of newly created shell corporations. Each corporation was a ghost, a legal fiction with a name like Ethelred Holdings or Viridian Educational Trust, designed to obscure the money's final destination. The trail hopped from domestic banks to more anonymous financial havens in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, a common tactic for criminals in the modern era, but a work of financial genius for the late 1960s. This was not the panicked act of a failing headmaster. It was the calculated exit strategy of a man who knew he was about to commit an act so monstrous it required the complete erasure of his own existence. The midpoint transformation of the case was stark and chilling. This was no longer a tragic mystery of missing persons. It was now an active manhunt for a con artist and a potential mass murderer who had successfully used a fabricated financial collapse as the perfect cover for his crime. The question that hung in the air of the command center was no longer just, what happened? But, how could one man orchestrate a deception of this magnitude and remain invisible for so long? The answer, they knew, lay with Dr. Julian Croft himself. Finding a man who had vanished 40 years prior, armed with a fortune and a new identity, seemed an impossible task. But Croft had made a single, crucial mistake, born of either arrogance or necessity. One of the shell corporations, used to purchase a small, insignificant parcel of land in rural Washington state in 1970, had never been fully dissolved. It remained on the books, a single, frayed thread connecting the ghost of 1968 to the present day. Following that thread, investigators unraveled a chain of identities and transactions that led them, finally, to a quiet, secluded estate outside of Seattle. Dr. Julian Croft was alive. Now in his late 80s, he was living under the name Dr. Elias Vance, a celebrated but intensely private philanthropist known for his generous donations to medical research and the arts. He had crafted a new identity as a reclusive intellectual, a man whose public persona was one of gentle wisdom and quiet benevolence. He was a pillar of a community that had no idea he was a ghost, a wolf who had shed his skin and spent 4 decades masquerading as a shepherd. His carefully constructed world was about to be invaded. The estate was a fortress of modern architecture, all glass and steel, surrounded by a dense forest that mirrored the isolation of Blackwood. It was a sterile, controlled environment, the home of a man who valued order and left nothing to chance. Detective Corbin and Alastair Finch drove through the imposing front gates. a silent agreement passing between them. Corbin would be the voice of the law, calm and procedural. Alistair would be the ghost at the feast, the living embodiment of a past Croft had tried to bury under a mountain of earth and lies. They were met in a minimalist, sun-drenched living room by Croft himself. He was physically frail but possessed an unyielding intensity in his eyes. He was impeccably dressed, his movements slow but deliberate. When Detective Corbin introduced himself and stated the reason for his visit, the reopening of the Blackwood case, Croft's performance was masterful. He summoned a look of profound, weary sadness, the expression of a man forced to revisit the greatest tragedy of his life. He spoke of his failed dream with a poet's sorrow. He recounted the official story with flawless precision. He spoke of overzealous investors, of dreams that outpaced funding, and of the heartbreaking decision to shutter the school to save his students from the chaos of a messy public bankruptcy. He claimed the chartered buses were organized by a third-party logistics company that subsequently went out of business, leaving him with no records. He lamented that the students, scattered to the winds, had never formed an alumni association, a final, sad testament to his project's abrupt end. Then he addressed the discovery of the buried school. A tragic coincidence, he stated, his voice smooth as polished stone. A freak act of nature. That landslide buried my legacy, a final, cruel insult from the forces that conspired against my vision. He presented himself as the ultimate victim of the Blackwood saga, an educational visionary whose life's work was destroyed first by finance and then by geology. He offered his full cooperation, the picture of a man with absolutely nothing to hide. For a moment, the sheer force of his conviction was almost believable. He had been rehearsing this performance for 40 years, and it was polished to a terrifying perfection. But then, Alistair Finch spoke for the first time, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 4 decades of unresolved grief. He did not ask about the bankruptcy or the buses. He leaned forward slightly, holding Croft's gaze, and uttered the words from his sister's note. "Dr. Croft," Alistair began, his voice steadied despite the tremor in his hands. "My sister, Eleanor, wrote about your cognitive acceleration sessions. She wrote about the blinding headaches her classmates suffered. She mentioned a place she called the sick room, and she said it wasn't progress. She said it was a cage. Can you tell me about that?" It was not a question. It was an incrimination. For a single, imperceptible beat, the mask of the benevolent educator did not just crack. It shattered. A flicker of pure, cold panic flared in Croft's eyes, a micro-expression of a cornered animal. His jaw tightened almost invisibly, and the placid, sorrowful lines around his mouth hardened into a grimace of raw fury. It was there for only a second, a brief glimpse into the abyss behind the facade. But it was enough. Alistair saw it. Corbin saw it. Croft recovered with the speed of a lifelong predator. He forced a small, dismissive laugh. "Ah, yes," he said, waving a hand as if brushing away a fly. The dramatic interpretations of a gifted, imaginative child. We were pushing the boundaries of learning. Such experimental methods can be disorienting. I assure you it was all perfectly safe, a standard part of our advanced curriculum. But the denial was hollow, the words empty. The truth had been in that flicker of his eyes. The interview concluded shortly after. Handshakes were exchanged, and promises of further cooperation were made, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The lie had been exposed. not by a piece of evidence, but by a memory. As they walked back to their car, the silence between Alistair and Corbin was thick with certainty. They had just spoken to the man responsible for the disappearance of 37 people. "He's the one," Corbin said, his voice flat and absolute. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a fact. The challenge now was to find the physical proof to corroborate the certainty they both felt. Croft's slip had been a crucial victory, but in a court of law, a flicker in the eye was not enough. They needed something tangible, something that Croft, for all his meticulous planning, had failed to destroy. Their focus immediately shifted back to the Blackwood campus. If Croft was lying about the nature of his work, then the evidence of that work had to be somewhere on the grounds. The idyllic classrooms and the perfectly preserved library were a stage, a carefully arranged set piece designed to support the evacuation narrative. But where had the real drama unfolded? Where was the sick room Eleanor had written about? Alistair, poring over the original architectural blueprints of the academy that he had sourced from the county archives, found the answer. The West Wing, the site of Croft's private experiments, was not structurally connected to the main academic hall that had been buried. It was a separate, windowless annex, built with reinforced concrete and soundproofed walls, set slightly apart from the rest of the campus. And crucially, it had not been touched by the landslide. According to the official 1968 reports, the West Wing had been sealed and condemned due to structural faults months before the school's closure. It was another lie, another piece of administrative fiction designed to divert attention. It was the one part of the campus that had been deliberately excluded from the narrative of the school's final day. Why would a man go to such lengths to legally and physically isolate one specific part of his own school? The answer was as obvious as it was chilling. The West Wing was not part of the stage. It was the backstage area where the terrible truth of Croft's progress was hidden. Whatever had happened at Blackwood, its origins, its execution, and its evidence were all waiting behind the sealed doors of that concrete annex. It was the one place Croft had needed to keep the world out of, both then and now. A new warrant was drawn up, this one not for a historical site, but for a suspected laboratory at the heart of a 40-year-old mass homicide. The legal language was precise, citing Eleanor's note and Croft's suspicious reaction as probable cause. The investigative team prepared to return to the valley, their mission no longer one of recovery, but of forced entry. They were going back to open the one door that Julian Croft never wanted opened. The West Wing stood apart from the main excavation site, a grim, concrete monolith half swallowed by 40 years of forest overgrowth. Its steel door was rusted shut, its keypad lock a relic of a bygone technological era. There were no windows, no visible points of entry. It was a tomb designed from the outset to contain a secret. The team assembled before it, armed with cutting torches and hydraulic rams, ready to breach the final wall of Croft's fortress of lies. For Alistair, this was the culmination of a life spent in the shadow of a question. He had followed his sister's voice from a dusty note in a book to the sterile home of her probable killer, and now back to the source of her fear. He knew, with an instinct that transcended evidence, that the answer to everything, the experiment, the disappearances, the landslide, was on the other side of that door. The air was thick with anticipation as the forensic team prepared the breaching equipment. The hum of a generator cut through the forest silence, a modern sound intruding upon a place that had been left to the quiet judgment of time. They were no longer just excavating a building. They were on the verge of excavating the truth itself, a truth that had been intentionally and violently suppressed. The search for the students of Blackwood had led them through a maze of financial records and faded memories, a journey from a buried classroom to the doorstep of a phantom philanthropist. They had successfully deconstructed the lie, piece by painstaking piece, until only one sealed location remained. They believed they were prepared for what they might find within the walls of the West Wing. But the truth of what Dr. Julian Croft had done in the name of progress was more monstrously methodical than any of them could have possibly conceived. They had unraveled the cover-up, but they had not yet grasped the sheer scale of the crime it was designed to hide. The darkest chapter of the Blackwood Academy was waiting for them, preserved in the cold, silent air behind one last, heavily fortified door. The grinding shriek of the cutting torch was the first sound to violate the West Wing's 40-year silence. Sparks cascaded into the gloom, illuminating the rusted, impregnable steel door that had guarded Dr. Croft's darkest secret. As the final locking mechanism was severed, the heavy door swung inward with a deep groan, releasing a gust of cold, sterile air that smelled not of dust and time, but of antiseptic and ozone. It was the scent of a laboratory, not a school, and it was the first confirmation that they had crossed a threshold into the true heart of Blackwood. Inside, the contrast with the main school was immediate and jarring. There were no chalkboards, no scattered books, no remnants of a life interrupted. This was a place of cold, brutal function. The main chamber was a primitive medical laboratory, lined with stainless steel tables and strange, archaic-looking electronic equipment. Thick cables snaked across the concrete floor, leading to a series of reclining chairs fitted with heavy leather restraints. This was not a place of learning. It was a place of experimentation, and its design spoke of a profound disregard for the comfort of its subjects. On a side table, a tray of hypodermic needles lay in neat rows, the dried brownish residue of their last use still visible in the bottom of glass vials. Medical charts were clipped to a board on the wall, filled with cryptic notes and dosage calculations next to the names of students, including Eleanor Finch. The clinical nature of the records was horrifying, reducing the nation's brightest young minds to a series of data points in a monstrous equation. Alistair felt a cold sickness rise in him as he saw his sister's name listed under a column titled Adverse Cognitive Reaction. Detective Corbin's team moved with grim efficiency, their forensic lights cutting through the shadows and revealing the full scope of the room's purpose. They found small, soundproofed observation rooms, each containing a single hard-backed chair and a one-way mirror looking out into the main lab. This was where Croft had watched his experiments unfold, a detached god observing the agonizing results of his quest for progress. The entire annex was an architecture of control and cruelty, a hidden testament to the hubris that had consumed its creator. In a small Spartan office at the back of the lab, the air was different, heavy with the ghost of absolute authority. A single desk and chair faced the wall, which was dominated by a large, acoustic-tiled map of the campus. It was a command center. While his investigators catalogued the grim artifacts in the lab, Alistair scanned the room, his historian's eyes searching for an anomaly. He found it behind a framed copy of Croft's doctoral diploma, a faint, rectangular outline in the wall, almost imperceptible. It was the door to a hidden wall safe. The safe was a vintage model, but its lock was no match for the team's modern equipment. With a final decisive click, the heavy steel door swung open. The contents were sparse. There were several stacks of bearer bonds, the seed money for Croft's new life, and a single, leather-bound ledger. But beneath them lay the true prize. the object that would unravel everything. It was a small, unassuming box containing a single reel-to-reel audio tape, labeled simply Project Chimera, Final Log, 12th, October 1968. They brought a vintage tape player from the evidence van. In the profound silence of the Oregon forest, surrounded by the ghosts of the West Wing, Detective Corbin pressed the play button. A low hiss filled the air, followed by the voice of a much younger Dr. Julian Croft. But it was not the calm, authoritative voice of the intercom. This was the voice of a man in the grip of panic, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him in real time. The tape was his confession. The control group has failed. Croft's voice began, strained and breathless, the synthesis of psilocybin and the mnemonic conditioning. It was supposed to unlock the brain's latent architecture, a shortcut to genius. He paused, and the sound of a heavy object falling could be heard in the background. But it's not unlocking anything. It's shattering it. 12 of them. They've descended into a state of violent, paranoid psychosis. They don't recognize us. They don't recognize themselves. They are lost. The investigators listened, frozen in place, as Croft detailed the catastrophic failure of his secret experiment. His cognitive accelerations were not a pedagogical method. They were a dangerous and unethical medical trial. He had used his students as human guinea pigs, convinced his genius would protect them. He had promised them progress, but he had delivered only madness. The headaches Eleanor wrote about were the least of it. The true price was the irreversible destruction of the mind. I cannot let this be my legacy. The voice on the tape continued, rising in desperation. A lifetime of work, the future of education. It cannot end in scandal, in disgrace. The project must be preserved, the subjects contained. The coldness that entered his tone was more chilling than the panic. It was the sound of a man making a monstrous calculation, choosing his reputation over the lives of 37 people. The contingency plan he had designed for just such a failure was now being activated. The audio log became a step-by-step account of the crime. He described triggering the emergency drill alarm, his voice a perfect facsimile of calm authority over the intercom, a stark contrast to his panicked state on the tape. He detailed how he guided the confused but obedient students and staff, both the affected and the healthy, into the storm shelter under the guise of safety, a shepherd leading his entire flock to a sealed, concrete pen. The ventilation system is engaged, Croft narrated, his breathing now heavy and ragged. The sedative compound is airborne. They will feel nothing, just a gentle sleep. He was not just documenting the event. He was justifying it, framing his act of mass murder as a humane, necessary act of preservation. He was euthanizing his failed experiment, erasing the evidence of his catastrophic miscalculation before the world could ever discover it. He then described the final brilliant stroke of his cover-up. He spoke of the demolition expert he had paid months earlier, a man who believed he was preparing the site for a new building foundation. Croft explained how he had triggered the pre-planted charges himself, sending tons of earth and rock cascading down the mountainside to entomb the main academic hall. It was a masterwork of deception, creating a perfect time capsule that would sell the story of a sudden evacuation while leaving the incriminating West Wing untouched and hidden behind its condemned status. The final words on the tape, spoken after a long, profound silence, were the ultimate expression of his narcissistic delusion. My legacy could not be sacrificed for their madness. he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I have preserved them. They are a monument to a failed theory, buried but pure." The tape clicked off, and the hiss of empty air filled the room. The 40-year-old silence of Blackwood had been broken by the voice of its architect, confessing to a crime more cold-blooded and methodical than anyone had dared to imagine. Armed with the irrefutable proof, Detective Corbin and Alastair Finch drove back to the secluded estate outside Seattle. There was no pretense this time, no gentle questioning. They were met once again in the sterile, sunlit living room by the man who called himself Elias Vance. He offered them tea, the benevolent philanthropist playing his role to the very end. Corbin simply placed the reel-to-reel player on the glass coffee table between them. "We found your final log, Doctor," Corbin said, his voice devoid of emotion. He pressed play. As Croft's own panicked voice from 1968 filled the pristine modern room, the transformation was absolute. The mask of the gentle, elderly intellectual did not just crack. It disintegrated into dust. The serene blue eyes hardened into chips of ice. The sorrowful lines around his mouth tightened into a sneer of contempt. He was no longer Elias Vance, the philanthropist. He was Julian Croft, the scientist, the genius, the murderer, listening to the echo of his own damnation. He did not deny it. He did not rage. When the tape ended, he simply looked at Alastair, a flicker of what might have been scientific curiosity in his gaze. "You must be one of the siblings," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "I suppose there were loose ends." It was, in hindsight, an imperfect solution. There was no remorse, no guilt, only the cold, detached analysis of a failed experiment. His lack of humanity was the final, most horrifying revelation of all. The arrest was a quiet, anticlimactic affair. Dr. Julian Croft, the visionary educator and celebrated philanthropist, was led away in handcuffs, his face a blank mask of intellectual arrogance. His carefully constructed 40-year lie had been undone by his own recorded voice, a trophy of his crime that his hubris had not allowed him to destroy. The news of his arrest and the dark truth of his experiment sent a shockwave through the academic and philanthropic worlds that had revered him. The audio log provided one final, terrible gift: the exact coordinates of the storm shelter. It was not on the main campus grounds, but located nearly a mile away, deep in the dense woods, its entrance concealed by decades of natural overgrowth. A specialized team was dispatched. Their mission to unseal what they now knew was a tomb. The massive steel door, rusted but structurally sound, was pried open, revealing a darkness that had been undisturbed for 40 years. Inside, the remains of the 32 students and 5 staff members of the Blackwood Academy were found. They were arranged in postures of sleep, victims of an airborne poison that had claimed them peacefully and absolutely. It was a scene of profound tragedy, a mass grave for a generation of brilliant minds, their potential extinguished by the monstrous ego of the man who had promised to nurture it. The last question of the Blackwood mystery, where were they, was finally, definitively answered. For Alastair Finch, standing at the edge of the police cordon and looking toward the dark maw of the shelter's entrance, the moment was not one of triumph. The truth he had sought for his entire life had been found, but it was a truth more monstrous than any nightmare he could have conjured. The gnawing void of uncertainty had been replaced by the cold, heavy certainty of a massacre. He had found his sister. He had found them all. The discovery of the bodies was a definitive, heartbreaking end to 40 years of speculation. The legal case against Croft, was now absolute, built upon his own confession and the grim physical evidence from the shelter. The narrative of the lost school was over, replaced by the horrific factual account of the Blackwood massacre. The world now knew that the students had not been scattered. They had been gathered, executed, and buried by their headmaster. Justice, it seemed, was now inevitable. The complex machinery of the legal system began to turn, preparing for what would be one of the most sensational trials of the century. The benevolent mask of Dr. Elias Vance was gone forever, and the world was now forced to look upon the true face of Dr. Julian Croft, a man whose ambition had led him to commit an almost perfect crime. The media descended upon the small Oregon Valley, their cameras and microphones broadcasting the grim discovery to a horrified world. For the few surviving family members of the victims, now elderly and frail, the news was a final, brutal blow. They had spent a lifetime wondering, hoping against hope. Now they knew the truth, and the knowledge was a unique form of agony, a closure that offered no peace. Alistair turned away from the shelter and walked back through the woods, the sounds of the investigation fading behind him. He had fulfilled a silent promise made to his sister 40 years ago. He had found the truth, no matter how ugly. He had given her back her name and her story, wresting it from the self-serving narrative of the man who had stolen her future. The West Wing stood silent, its secrets now exposed to the light. The buried academic hall remained a monument to an interrupted day, and deep in the woods, the storm shelter had given up its dead. Every piece of the puzzle was now on the table, a complete and terrible picture of what had happened on that crisp autumn afternoon in 1968. The silence of Blackwood had been a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to conceal an unspeakable act. Now that silence had been irrevocably broken, replaced by the loud, clear voice of the truth. The revelation was complete, the mystery solved, but the emotional fallout, the quest for a justice that could never truly balance the scales, was just beginning.